Are we ready to do panel mode? In this tutorial, I'm going to show the best way I have found to set up my machine to use panel mode to make the largest panel possible, as well as how to cast on, cast off, some troubleshooting, and also how I like to count my rows because the row counter does not work in panel mode. So this is going to be a pretty in-depth tutorial, hopefully, to help you have the best success on doing panels on your machine. I'm first going to start out with just practicing how I set up my machine, how I mark the needles, and also how I do my initial cast on. After that, we're going to do a test project of making a tea towel using 100% cotton yarn. So let's get going on making panels. So some things you're going to need is your yarn. You're going to need waste yarn. Also going to need a loom pick, something to cut your yarn with, stitch markers, and then I got a digital row counter off Amazon. These are really nice. They go on your finger. This is optional, but I like it. If you don't have a loom pick, you can also use a paper clip like this, but a loom pick is really nice. Next, we want to switch the machine to panel mode. P is for panel, T is for tube, so you want to make sure it's clicked up into panel mode. I also marked with a Sharpie a few things. So the 46th needle, the yarn will hook onto. The 47th just has a dot. The yarn does not hook on there. But this post, the yarn wraps around this. So I have it marked so I can see it as a visual. It goes back and forth. And so I also marked down here because you guys will see it more down here. That mark is for this post. The yarn needs to go over that twice. My 48th needle, that has a dot. The yarn doesn't go on there. The first needle, second needle, same thing. They just have dots because the yarn does not hook on there. And then my third needle, it has a line because the yarn hooks onto that needle. And then same with the post. For my view, I have it marked right here because I know the yarn needs to wrap around that twice. And then for your view, I have a mark down here so you can see that. So that will make a little more sense, but that's how I marked it, and this helps me a lot to know what I'm doing. So your cast on is like your chain. If you're crocheting, that's kind of your foundation. So then the machine's able to create the stitches as you make your rows. So for the panel mode, you want to make sure your button is up, because we're at P for panel and T is for tube. So panel is up. And then I like to set the machine when I'm cranking back. The white needle's here, I can't go any further. That's how you know you're in panel mode. And then when you crank forward, it will stop you as well. So you can't continuously go around and around in a tube. So I like to set my machine to start my cast on here. So I'm cranking forward. That's just me personally, because I'm starting from 1 and counting up. So I have my machine marked as well, because to make the biggest and use the most needles that I feel works the best is to start at your 3rd needle and you're going to end at your 46th needle. So I have those marked with a Sharpie with a line, and then I have these pegs marked as well as a visual that these are my starting and stopping points. And then for the 47th, the 48th, the 1st and 2nd needle, I just have a little dot with a Sharpie just as a visual for me to remember no yarn goes on these. So to start with your cast on, we're going to start by cranking forward at our 3rd needle. And so I take my yarn. This is a number 3 weighted yarn, a lightweight yarn, and this one is really nice because since it's smaller, it works easier in the machine. So we're not going to do a project, we're just going to practice casting on and making a few rows. So this is what I recommend to do. It's just to practice. Here's our 3rd needle. We want to catch that needle with our yarn. And let me move this a little bit forward so you can see now. We're going to catch him in the front so he's on the needle, right? And now we're going to crank forward, and we're going to go to our 4th needle and we're going to go behind him, and then we're going to go in front of our 5th, behind the 6th, in front of the 7th, behind the 8th, and so on. So you're going under and over each needle one time around. and you don't want it really loose and you don't want to be pulling super tight. You just kind of want it to be just like touching the front or the back side of the needle. But it's important to make sure when you're casting on, it's going underneath so it can hook. And so it's every other one is your cast on. And I believe you have to do this. I don't know any other way of how to cast on. And you want to make sure you do every other, and then it should look like this, where if you have your pegs, it's like 2, and then skip, 2, skip, 2, skip, 2, skip, all the way around till we get to our 46th needle. And so if you see, here's my line. So that's just kind of a nice visual. There's my 46th needle. We're going to go around. I have my line at my peg. That's where I know this yarn's going to stop. We're not going to go anymore. Now I'm just going to move my camera angle a little bit so you can see where the yarn needs to go from here to do our first row. So once we're here, we're at our 46th needle. Now we need to put our yarn in the yarn holder, and you want to make sure then it's also in your yarn tensioner. And then the yarn needs to be all the way down in the front here so it catches that needle. And then we're going to start cranking back towards us, and now it's caught that needle and it's going to start catching all the other needles too. Now you may need to just help that piece of yarn come down and around this peg before it catches this next needle so it's doing the correct stitch. And you'll see as it's going around, it's now catching them all. And if it's done it correctly, now it's going to look like this, where it's kind of making this X shape or an over and under every other needle. It's kind of like a circle under, circle under. This is how it should look. And then once we get back to our start, there's our peg showing that's where we end. It's now going to wrap around that peg, and then we're going to start cranking it forward again. It's going to go around the peg a second time right there, and now we're starting our next row. And now if it's making it correctly, it's going to look like this on every single needle now. So now we're back. We have our last peg, and now here, want to make sure, sometimes you have to help it with the loom pick to make sure that loop is down and around those two tiny pegs. Now it's going to go over this peg once, we stop, and now we start cranking back. On this peg here, it's going to go around that peg again and catch our needle, and now we're making our next row. Now that we've learned how to cast on, let's do a test project on making a tea towel using the waste yarn cast on method and cotton yarn for our project yarn. So let's get going. So now I'm going to take my yarn and I put it in a bowl, and I'm going to put that on the ground in front of the machine, and that's where my waste yarn will be as well. I want to set up the machine so I get to crank forward, and I'm starting on the third needle. That's where I start the cast on, and we go over and under each needle starting with the number 3 needle. And we go all the way around until we get to that 46th needle right there. So it's hooked on there. And now we're going to put it down into the yarn tensioner and then the yarn holder. And then now we're going to start, I make sure it flips around that post. It has to be under there. And now I'm going to start cranking backwards, and you're going to see it has to go back over that post again. And then it hooks onto the needle again. And now we are doing our first row. And this is the waste yarn, so I'm not going to count these rows, but I do quite a few rows of waste yarn. So now we get back to that third needle. You see it hooks there, has to go over the post and down. And now we go back around. It has to go back over that post. And now we're going the other way. So at this point you want to take your time because those 46th and that third needle, the yarn will get stuck on. It got stuck right here. You'll want your loom pick or your paper clip to make sure everything's seated down properly. And you just want to make sure it's over those two teeny posts and around where it needs to be. And you'll see when we get back, now we're going back around the post. And now we're going the other way. And I'm doing this in real time so you guys can see it. And then here's where it gets stuck on the needle. That happens a lot. That's why a loom pick comes in handy. It'll get stuck quite a bit on that third needle and the 46th needle, especially in the beginning. And I do more like 10 rows of waste yarn because I want a really nice, good foundation for it before I get to my project yarn, because also those two ending needles, the third one and the 46th one that it ends on, it's really easy to tuck a stitch where you get two stitches hooked in the front, and you definitely don't want that. So it's easier to get that out of the way on your waste yarn and have the machine working good before you add on to your project yarn. The yarn I'm using, it's a number 3 weighted yarn. The number 3 is a little bit easier to use. My waste yarn, I'm using an acrylic yarn. And then my project yarn, it's 100% cotton because I'm going to make the tea towels with it. And so I feel like that's just a nice, easy, friendly beginner project to figuring out panels. Okay, so I jumped ahead. I have about 10 or 12 rows of waste yarn here. So once I get that, and I'm going to do my last row here. So I'm going to stop it at my third needle, take my waste yarn out, put it in the middle of the machine, and now we're going to add on our project yarn. And again, we only need it, make sure it's down, seated all the way into that yarn holder and in the tensioner, and then we need it to be wrapped around the third needle. So again, I'm going to show this in real time, and just take your time with it. And that's why it's nice I have the dots, and then I have the line where the third needle is. It's just kind of a nice visual to where I know it has to go under the post and then hook on to the third needle. So that needle right there, make sure it hooks on. And then I'm kind of holding both tails together just to make sure they don't slip out. And now this is row 1. And now we want to start counting our rows. So there's row 1. And then I'll count it with my counter. Now we're going to go back the other way. And here's row 2. And then once I get all the way back around, then I'll click my counter again. And since this is only row 2, I'm going to hold on to those tails and I'm going to slow down just to make sure. Do row 2. Now we're going to go back around again. Row back and forth. And I do tie a little knot, just a loose knot on those two tail ends just to keep them secure. And we're just going to go back and forth like this. So now we're working with our project yarn. And this is 100% cotton yarn, so it does seem to stick a little bit more, but it works very well since it's a number 3 lightweight yarn. And then again, it gets a little stuck. And you just want to make sure everything's pushed down and seated where it needs to be. And then I'll jump ahead a little bit more. You see where a stitch gets tucked coming up here. So I'll show you that as we're coming around. It's on the last needle, that's where it seems to always happen. It's actually tucked there because there's 2 loops in front. And I'll do another video with a close-up of this, but I just stop and we have to put one of those loops back around the needle so it's no longer tucked. So that can happen. It definitely happens when the project begins or if like I'm going too fast and I didn't catch it, that it didn't pop all the way down, up and over. So got that fixed, and we'll continue. Next, I'll show how I count my rows once I get a few rows. So now how I count my rows, I'm going to zoom in here. You can see I have the project yarn, and then that dark teal, that's my waste yarn. So that first row of white, that's my project, and I count these little loops here. So if we start 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's my 10th one. I'm just going to stick my loom pick in there. I'm going to add a stitch marker. For the first time I count as a double check, I count 10 first. Get that hooked up here, and now let's double check our count. We're at 10, and it's 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 21, 22 up underneath that peg. There's no more, so I should have 22 rows. I counted, I check my row counter, and we match. So that's how I double check my count. Next, once we get more rows, I'll show you how I continue to check my count, and we'll also finish up with the waste yarn and how to cast off. So to start with, we're going to continue with the counting of the rows. So at the end of part 1, I counted 10 rows and I marked it with that green stitch marker. So now when I go to count more rows, I know where that green stitch marker at, that's my 10th row. I'm just going to count 10 more up, and I count these little loops here. So I'm at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Mark it with your loom pick, and just for this one right now, I'm going to move this green stitch marker up, and that's my 20th row. And then when I get to my 40th row, I'll mark it again with another stitch marker, so then I can count 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. Next, we do still have more rows on here, so we just need to continue to count up till you get under that peg and there's no more rows. And I'm at 30, and that's how I double check that I have 30 rows on my digital counter. And that's the easiest way I found just to continue to check myself to make sure I'm not doing too many or not enough rows. And this definitely comes in handy when you want to make panels for clothing. And then a tip I got in one of the comments on my other videos from Armadillo Alert was to try binder clips to help with tuck stitches so it doesn't get stuck on that 3rd and that 46 needle. So I have these larger ones that I'm going to try out, and this did seem to help. It would still get stuck every now and then. I'm pretty sure because I'm using 100% cotton yarn. Acrylic is silkier and slips around easier, but this seemed to work really good and I didn't have as much issues. So this really helped. It got stuck on the screw, so folding in the tabs worked better. This was great. Thank you so much for the awesome tip. So now once we get done with our 100 rows, we are going to cast off, and we want to use our waste yarn. So we want to put our project yarn in the middle of the machine, and I keep it on the skein because we're going to use that to make our edging later. And so might as well just keep it on there, and then we don't have to try to tie it on. Now we're going to add on our waste yarn, and we want to take our waste yarn, put it all the way down in the yarn holder and then the tensioner, and then we're going to put it onto the 3rd needle right where our project yarn has come off. And so we want it to go under that needle and hook on, and then we'll go back and forth again. And again, I will do quite a few of these rows of the waste yarn just to make sure everything stays tight and secure. And then you also get that curl from the beginning and ending of your project. So this helps where the waste yarn curls, and it's really easy to identify our project yarn, and the project yarn has a tighter stitch as well. And again, you just want to be careful when you are adding onto that yarn, when you're going back and forth. Take your time to make sure nothing slips or tucks. Once I got a couple rows, I knot the 2 tail ends together, and then I finish up my rows. Once you get as many as you want, I think I did about 10, then we can put the yarn in the middle out of the yarn holder, and then we crank it one time around with no yarn, and then when we crank it back, it will fall off the machine. And since those are live stitches at the end of that waste yarn, we didn't cast it off. They can unravel, so that's why you want to do about 10 or so rows. So here's what the project looks like once it's off the machine. We have our waste yarn here, and then 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 rows. So you can see how I mark those with the stitch markers, and it makes it really easy to count. And then we have our waste yarn that finishes, and I still have the project yarn attached. You'll see that there is a little bit of curl on the sides. So once we do the finished edge, that's going to help with the curling as well as blocking the project. That will help with the curling, and then that's why it's nice when we have the waste yarn, because the top and bottom have the curl in the waste yarn part of it, and we can identify our stitches really easily. So to do our edging, we're going to crochet them. So we're going to take our project yarn that's still attached, and I have a 3.5 millimeter crochet hook that I'm going to use, and we're going to do single crochets, and we're going to crochet inside each one of these stitches. So you can see there's this line here. That's where I'm going to insert my crochet hook. So over this edged curl part, that's the part that was on the 3rd and 46th needle. That's what we're going to crochet around. I feel like that's what gives it the nicest look, but you can insert your crochet hook wherever you like. So to start our first single crochet, we want to yarn over, go through the project, yarn over, pull through. Now we have 2 loops on our hook. Now we yarn over again, pull through those 2 loops. That's our first single crochet. Now we can do the rest like normal. We have 1 loop on the hook, go through the project, yarn over, pull through. There's 2 loops on the hook, yarn over again and pull through the 2 loops. And that's our next single crochet. And we're going to continue this all the way down each one of those holes down along the side of our project. And you kind of just have to untwist it a little bit so you can get in there and see it. But you just do every single opening down, and it should be 100 of them if you're counting. And so I will speed this up, and I'll meet you down at the end. Now that we're at the end of the project where our waste yarn is, we're going to do our last few single crochets. And then we want to chain 1, and now we're going to start working on the stitches that are in our waste yarn. So this is why you want a contrasting color waste yarn, because you'll see that the white stitches that are in between those teal stitches, that's our first set of live stitches of our project. The other stitches that are the dark teal, that's our waste yarn. So you just want to pick up each one of those white stitches and do a single crochet all the way across. And then once you get done with all of these, you just want to go back and make sure you didn't miss any of those stitches, because once we remove the waste yarn, if we skipped any, it would unravel. So just make sure there's no holes in your project. If it is, just pull out the crochets that you did, and you'll just want to pick those up before we move on. Now that we're at the end of where the waste yarn stitches are, we're going to do the same thing like we did on the long side. So we finish up our single crochets, and then we're going to chain 1, and now we're going to start working again down along the long side of this, in between each of the stitches that the beginning and end needle made. And so there should be 100 of these. That will do 100 crochets, single crochets down. Now we're to our other part of our waste yarn. So once we get our 100th one done, we're going to do 1 chain. And now again, we're going to pick up each of those live stitches that are sandwiched in between our waste yarn. And that is the first row of white that's between the light teal this time. And again, just make sure you don't miss any of these. And then we'll meet back at the beginning. Now that we're back at the beginning of our project where we started, we just want to slip stitch to join, and then we can cut that. And now we want to remove our waste yarn. And so what I like to do, if you did the ravel cord method, you can just remove your ravel cord and it will come out. If you didn't, you can just take the tail end that's nearest your project stitches, and you can just kind of unwrap it, unknit it back and forth. And this is a little bit easier than going through all 10 rows. You can just pull it out this way. And you want to do this on both your cast on and cast off waste yarn. Remove it all by just unknitting the tail end that's closest to your projects, or use the ravel cord method, whichever you prefer. Once both sides of the waste yarn are removed, what's left is the tail ends of your project yarns. You just want to weave in those ends to the single crochets of your projects. And I just kind of do a knot, and then I weave them in back and forth, and then cut off any excess. Lastly, then you'd want to block your project. Next, we're going to look at some troubleshooting on how to fix tuck stitches on your Sentro Circular Knitting Machine. And here's just a finished project picture of my tea towel. This is part 3 on how I knit panels on my Sentro 48 needle circular knitting machine. And we're going to focus on tuck stitches. So what you're going to need is a loom pick, which I cannot find mine, so I'm using a paper clip, which works as well. And you're going to notice that there are 2 pieces of yarn on one needle. And that's what will become a tuck stitch if I do not fix it. So this happens a lot at the 3rd needle and the 46th needle when you are knitting the panels. So how I fix this is, first we have to gently move the crank handle so we can move the needle, and we have to get the working yarn. So that's the one that's still in the yarn holder, and that's the loop that's on the bottom right now. You'll see when I pull it, it moves the yarn, and we need to get that loop up and under the needle. So this will require either the paper clip like I'm using. A loom pick works really nice if you have that, because it's easy to hold on to and move. And then you'll need to move your crank handle just slightly so you can pull up that needle to get the yarn up underneath it. And you don't want to crank too much, or else you're going to start popping stitches off of the other needle. So it's just very little back and forth. Now that it's under there, we can crank it down and it should grab that yarn, and that's what we want. Another thing you want to watch is, you'll see the black mark I have on the peg. That's the peg that we stop at, and it has to go back over. If you go too far, like I did here, it's going to create an extra loop, which we do not want. We only want the yarn to catch under the 46th and the 3rd needle when we're starting the panels. And so now it's going back over and we're all good. But the reason why we don't go further over onto the 47th or the 48th needle is, you'll see when I come back around to the other side, since I cranked a little bit too far over, my 3rd needle here, it popped up a little bit when I cranked it a little bit too far over. And so that needle just moved just enough where it pops it off of those pegs. So we just have to put that peg back on, or the stitch back on the pegs, and then we should be good to go. So that's just something to watch out as well. And that's again why I mark those pegs, so I don't crank my handle too far over. And that's why there's those 4 needles that do not get any stitches on there. So that is how I fix the tuck stitches and try to prevent having drop stitches when I'm knitting the panels on my circular knitting machine. And then also adding weight to the project fabric once it's cranked out on the machine. I use the binder clip that was recommended, or you can also get some weights that help pull down the fabric, and that can help prevent those tucked and drop stitches as well. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and this practice project on making panels on your circular knitting machine. Thank you so much for all the likes and the follows and all the comments. I truly appreciate it, everybody. Happy crafting.